this is going to be strange. I'm only going to use the microphone only because Dr. Berenbaum has the lapel mic for everyone who's online. So hopefully, you guys let me know if you can hear me all right. Maybe I'm not going to be talking for more than a minute, and to introduce our guest speaker. We are really privileged today to have Dr. Michael Berenbaum with us. He's the director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. He's a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University and the author and editor of 20 books. He was also the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He was the project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute. He later served as president and CEO of the survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, which took the testimony of 52,000 Holocaust survivors in 32 languages and 57 countries. His work in film has won Emmy Awards and Academy Awards. Dr. Berenbaum is the author and editor of over 18 books and scores of scholarly articles and hundreds of journalistic pieces. And we are very fortunate to have him with us today. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Berenbaum.
Okay. Let me just ask, are you picking up the microphone as well? You guys are picking up the microphones?
They won't, so they're just gonna, would you like to talk about, they're gonna, this microphone is just for you to hear, for them to hear you online.
Okay. I'm going to talk without the microphone. I don't think you guys will have much problem hearing me. Okay. We're going to do a couple of things today. Let me set two ground rules, which is I believe that you are entitled to ask questions. The only thing I don't allow people to do is apologize for asking a question or to be cowards in asking a question. I'm not sure, but perhaps it could be the case that I'd rather you ask questions and interrupt at any point. Let me tell you what we're going to do today, and I'm very happy to be invited, one, and to see my old friend Mitch Bloomer, but also to be invited by two generations, as it were, of your colleagues. Leah and my daughter are friends, and I just got off the phone with my daughter admonishing me to treat Leah well. And Steve is, relatively speaking, new to this job, meaning that I haven't been here since, but during COVID, I guess nobody was here. And we have to speak of the world BC and the like, before COVID and the like. We all should begin by saying that you guys are deeply and profoundly underappreciated. And you guys have become, as teachers, more essential to the world we're going to confront than ever before. And I have a respect for your awesome responsibility, which has only become more complex in the divided world in which we live. Now, I'm going to say something that also is that the Holocaust has become the negative absolute in our society. There's a conclusion that I'm going to come to at the end of a long period of time. It's become the negative absolute, meaning in a world of relativism, we're not sure what's good, we're not sure what's bad, but Nazi, Holocaust, etc., that's evil. And that means that when you teach this material, you have an incredible opportunity to raise in enough of a far enough distance all of the issues that are shaking and dividing our society. And you can do so almost on quasi-protected grounds. That doesn't make your task easy, it makes your task more difficult and the like. You guys are going to be, for me, a little bit of guinea pigs. And that is that, Steve introduced me at one time writing 18 books, the other 20. I'm now up to, I'm not sure whether I'm up to 23 or 24, but this is 25. that you're going to hear in its infancy. I was given an assignment, which was to write about the America, the Holocaust, reflections of 3/4 of a century of the development of Holocaust consciousness in American society. And the guy gave me, wanted 60 pages, which meant that when I write some of you will have received my book, A Promise to Remember, which has the delightful thing is that it's 15 1,000-word chapters with a lot of, it's meant for the internet generation with a lot of inserts and material to come in and out. And the very interesting thing is it was easy to write the first 5,000 words for every chapter. What really cost me to work was to get it down from 5,000 to 1,000. And I didn't realize that writing short is really difficult. So when I had 60 pages to write, I could write long. And I realized that I ended up writing about 150 pages of the 60 pages. So, and then I cut. So what we're going to do is going to go through decade by decade what evolved in the consciousness of the Holocaust, come to what's going to be the meat, which is where the hell we are at this moment. But you're going to forgive me as I go all the way through. And again, anytime you want to interrupt, any questions you want to ask. And one other ground rule, which is I'll want you to introduce yourselves as you ask your questions, just so I know who you are, because we're not going around the room. You've probably done that already. And for the most part, most of you wearing name tags, so at least I'll be able to call upon you. Ground rules understood? Okay. We should ask at the beginning, when did the word Holocaust emerge? And when was consciousness of the Holocaust there? And what are the names that we call it? Because it's important to understand how we refer to it, what we deal with it, and the like. But I'd like to, by saying that while the Germans called the destruction of the Jews the final solution to the Jewish problem. Final solution, first of all, when you call something a problem, what are you looking for? Solution. The other way to call it is the Judenfrage, the Jewish question. And if you ask a question, what are you normally looking for? An answer. What is the power of the word final, which is you're going to solve it once and for all? And this radical notion of once and for all means that you're going to solve it ultimately by the elimination of the Jews, what they then ultimately spoke of as extermination. And when I'm not using Nazi speak, I refer to as annihilation. And the reason is because the Nazis used their language in a very particular way carefully. And language also is a way of revealing and concealing. By the way, one of the easiest examples of language revealing and concealing is think of how the Defense Department speaks about when an American soldier is killed by another American soldier. They call it friendly fire. I'm not sure there's anything friendly about the fire. And they don't want to call it incompetence, malfeasance, stupidity, irresponsibility, all of those things. And God forbid you lose a child or a parent or a sibling to incompetence, malfeasance, irresponsibility, stupidity, or anything like that. It's worse than losing somebody to the enemy, because this should have been what? Preventable. So language becomes very important. In one sense, there was no little consciousness of the Holocaust while it was taking place in the United States. And the people who had consciousness of the full scope of what happened were the people who then said, you cannot conduct business as usual. You have to scream, you have to yell, you have to go way beyond, and you have to organize in all sorts of ways. You have to demonstrate, you have to what? You have to go mad. But they were few and far between because the focus in the United States was World War II. Germany fought two wars. They fought a racial war, which was not only a war against the Jews, but it reached its apex in the war against the Jews. Racial war was to put in place the master race. So how do you put in place the master race? And remember, Germany did not begin with the idea that the final solution was going to take the form that it took. There is a book by Karl Schluss called The Twisted Road to Auschwitz. And that is and there was a debate between the intentionalists and the functionalists way back in the 90s in ancient history, last century, as to whether Nazism was born full-blown, whether Hitler intended in 1919 with his first anti-Semitic statement to get rid of the Jews by annihilation, by extermination. And the general consensus now is, yes, there was an ideology, and then there was an evolution of policy, but it was not born full-blown into the form that it ultimately took. And we can see fits and starts in terms of what happened. Best way to look at that is that the first 5 years of Nazi policy is based on the following premise. If you make it impossible for somebody to live as a Jew in Germany, they will what? Leave. The whole notion of immigration is what we call push-pull. The only way to understand immigration is push-pull. You're pushed from where you are, or you are pulled to somewhere else. The intensity of the push minimizes the nature of the pull. Meaning that if I hold a gun to Mitch's head, God forbid, Mitch is going to be inclined to go anywhere, right? He's not going to be choosy as to whether he goes in this room, that room, whether he goes to this restaurant, that restaurant, anywhere. The intensity of the push maximize the pull. Let me put it to you in a humorous way, and you'll see that humor was one of the tools by which the victims dealt with their fate. The humorous thing is a guy has recommended you can go to Australia, but it's very far from here. And he answers to that, I can think of no better recommendation. Meaning he never imagined himself going to Australia, but the push is so extreme that what? That anywhere is good. That's why Jews ended up in Shanghai. Now, what was the problem with this strategy? There were two problems with the strategy. The first is that the German universe kept expanding, right? 1938, they had gotten rid of 150,000 Jews from Germany. One night they incorporated Austria, and they got 200,000 Jews in the process. Therefore, they were a net gain of 50,000 Jews after 5 years of trying to get rid of the Jews. Time the Germans enter Poland, they get 2 million Jews. Remember, Poland is divided. So they get 2 million Jews, and the problem is you can't, if you keep expanding, you get more and more and more Jews. And consequently, your problem is you can't get rid of them by immigration, by making it impossible for them to live as Jews. The second problem with the policy was that there were no countries willing to receive the Jews in the numbers to which they had to immigrate. And I want to tell you, I just came back from Poland, and I saw the willingness of the Poles, the heroic willingness of the Poles to receive the Ukrainian refugees. And you begin to, and by the way, and the Ukrainian refugees are interesting because they're going to stay and then go back. Many of them, as the territories have become more secure, and hopefully they will remain secure, people are going back because the men stayed, the women and the children left. The irony is that in Nazi Germany, when they conquered territories, men fled, never believing that the Nazis would murder women and children. So you have a whole range of people, families, with the idea that they were vulnerable, but their families were not, only to discover what? That their families, when they left and escaped, their families were what? Were decimated and destroyed. Yes, sir.
Great, guys. I'm Steve Frick. Got a question about, I always get this question during class about what did the US know? Now, what people knew as opposed to government, and I've had a hard time kind of really answering that.
Okay.
And that goes to the immigration. Did they receive
Let me begin by telling you that we have to make a distinction. There's a distinction, this is a sociological distinction between knowledge and information. And that is, and I'll give it to you theoretically, then I'll give it to you practically. Okay? Theoretically. The sociologist Peter Berger says there are 3 stages to what takes information and makes it knowledge. One is externalization, the other is objectification, the third is internalization. Let me give you an example, and I may be arrested here for talking in Florida, but let me give you an example. Somebody comes up to me and tells me a student of mine is pregnant. I say, woman is too sophisticated, too responsible, could never happen. Student then is sitting in my house and she turns to me looking ghostly white and, excuse me, I have to go to ladies' room. I take that as confirming or giving me an objective source to say that she may indeed be pregnant. She then says to me, I would like to meet with you, but you have to promise me that this is confidential. You will not tell my parents, you will not tell the administration, et cetera, et cetera. What am I believing that she's about to tell me? That she's pregnant. And if she doesn't tell me she's pregnant, it will take me a long time to believe that she's actually leveling with me. What does that mean? It means that the information that came out is, garbage out, lots of rumors. It then gets confirmation, and then you perceive the world through the lens of the information you have. Let's show how that impacts the victims in an incredible way. You are a Jew who is in between German occupied territory and Soviet occupied territory. If you judge by history, in World War I, the Germans were benign occupiers. The Russians raped, stole, looted all the way through. What decision do you make if you judge on the basis of history? You stay in German territory. Now, if you begin to believe all the information that's been coming through about what Nazism is about, you say Stalin is not a good guy, but I'm safer what? In Soviet territory than in German territory. Now, a very interesting thing happened to Polish Jews who went to the Soviet Union, to Soviet occupied territories. In 1940, they were given a choice of taking Soviet citizenship or keeping Polish citizenship. If they chose Soviet citizenship, they stayed put. They were treated like everybody else. However way you want to describe life under communism, they had food, etc., etc. If they were chose to remain Polish, they were sent to Siberia, thinking that that was the worst catastrophe imaginable. Frozen, starved, disease, malnutrition, right? Uncertainty, horrific living conditions, the coldest of winters, the hottest of summers. Oh my God, this is horrific. 5 years later, they come back and they realize that everybody who stayed behind was what? Dead, murdered. They ended up living in paradise without what? Knowing it. American policy. Lots of information was available. Some people felt that it was confirmed. Then they internalized it and they did something about it. But most people never imagined that it would be that. Example par excellence. August 26, 1944. John J. McLoy writes about the bombing of Auschwitz. There's considerable opinion to the effect that even if such an act were practicable, it might provoke a more vindictive response on the part of the Germans. If we bomb Auschwitz, they may do something worse. Now, I can't believe for a moment that he understood what Auschwitz was, because I can't imagine what is much worse than Auschwitz. Might provoke more vindictive action on the part of the Germans. He had lots of information, but the information never became for him confirmed, never internalized for action. So when you say, what did Americans know? You had lots of information, but that information only was understood by certain people. Second example, Rabbi Steve receives a telegram, and some of you got my book. You can hold the telegram out. First of all, for your students, it's going to be unbelievable what a telegram is. They have no idea. They have no idea what a telegram is. And I would say that even some of the youngest of the teachers here, right? Let's take a look at let's pick on Leah. Leah, have you ever held a telegram? No. Okay. The way a good joke. You know what a Jewish telegram is? Start worrying, letter to follow. In other words, start worrying, letter to follow. But he receives a telegram describing that there is under consideration, Hitler has quarter plan for the final solution of the Jewish problem, of the Jewish question. They're speaking of Zyklon B to murder once and for all the Jews of Europe, Zyklon B, etc., etc. The information is guarded. We transmit this information with all due reservations, as exactitude cannot be determined. Informants said to have highest contacts in Hitler's headquarters, and his reports have been generally reliable. For those of us who, again, are old enough to remember the way in which intelligence information was given about the Iraq War, right? They didn't give you all of the limitations. So informants said to have highest contacts in Hitler's headquarters. That's a rumor. We don't know that for what? For sure. His reports have generally been reliable. 80%, 70%, 90%, right? And then it says Foreign Office, and this was sent by a British member of Parliament, a British Jewish member of Parliament, sent it to Rabbi Wise. Foreign Office has no information regarding this matter, which meant that when he received the original telegram, he went to the Foreign Office. They don't know anything about it. What does Stephen Wise do? He can't go to the press because he only has a rumor. If Samuel Silverman went to the Foreign Office, what does Rabbi Wise think that he should do? What's the equivalent of the Foreign Office in British in the United States? The State Department. Goes to the State Department says, we don't know. Don't go to the press, give us 3 months to find out. And it's interesting, we now know one of the new pieces of information coming out of the Vatican is that the American State Department went to the Vatican to verify the information, because unbeknownst to most of us, the Vatican has the best intelligence network in all of Europe at that point, because they had priests on the ground on both sides of the conflict in every community in the conflict. And though a priest may not report the particulars of something that happens in confession, otherwise he is excommunicated. And I don't have to say she, I believe, at this point. He is excommunicated. The priest can convey the general impression of what's happening to an independent source, the apostolic delegate or the papal nuncio, and therefore the intelligence information being received by the Vatican is the best in all of Europe. They have people on the ground. So we go to this, and the State Department in November turns to Rabbi Wise and says, we can confirm your darkest fears. Then they screw him, because he then goes to the press, and the State Department gives the following statement: we can neither confirm nor deny what he has said. Now that meant that it's communicated to the American people, not as government information, which in 1942 was trusted and was regarded with a seal of approval, but as Jewish rumors. And the problem is, during World War I, there were also rumors about all the atrocities that the Germans were committing. Let me give you one other example between knowledge and information. This is a complicated way to answer your students. Remember back to the, and we'll put on again, because she's probably the youngest in the room. She doesn't remember the buildup to the war in Iraq. War in Iraq, the buildup of the war in Iraq is, we were told by intelligence sources that they have weapons of mass destruction. Very interesting thing happens, which is that Saddam Hussein denies that there were weapons of mass destruction. What would you believe that a dictator would do if he got caught saying he had weapons of mass destruction, he had weapons of mass destruction? He clearly would lie about it. So nobody believes Saddam Hussein is saying, the perception is he had weapons of mass destruction. He's a dictator. He got caught with his hand in a cookie jar. What is he going to do? He's going to lie. Lo and behold, the son of a gun is a liar all the time. This time he did what? He told the truth. And we did not believe him. Therefore, we went to war. So that's the complication between knowledge and information. And remember, in a world in which lots of things are unknown, lots of information is forthcoming that lies to all sorts of confusions. Did I complicate the answers for you?
No, you didn't.
But this at least gives you a clear idea. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned.
Alex, tell me where he taught,
Oh, Lake Brantley High School.
and what do you teach?
I teach AP World and AP US.
I teach at Lebanon High School sociology and Holocaust studies.
Okay,
Earlier, Ukraine and Russia, and a bit ago, this semester, we were reading an article in class called Prove Yourself. And it has to do with this Nazi wife that lived with her kids in the Wild East. That's how they call it, Wild East. And she managed to pick up some Jew kids that were in the street, and she actually executed them herself. So this is, and the article mentioned in the 40s, and then it was in Ukraine. And a kid mentioned how, bringing it to modern day, the war between Ukraine and Russia, and there was, this kid heard some news about Nazi sympathizers in the Ukraine army. So my question is, how do you justify, if there is, we don't even know, right? But if the rumors were to be true, which will be considered small minority.
so let's do the following.
Mhm,
I'm going to get there,
mhm.
and you write down your question, and when I'm there, we'll talk about it. And the reason being, I don't want to get diverted to that. I don't want to get diverted to that because it has everything to do what's been achieved in the public consciousness of the Holocaust is that the Holocaust has become the nuclear weapon of moral epithets. In other words, the nuclear weapon of moral epithets. In other words, you want to say something is evil, you call it the Holocaust, or you want to say someone is evil, you call him Nazi or her Nazi. And the way, meaning we've already reached a certain stage. So let's come to that when we get there. I want to go back now and remember where we were. The Germans have a clear idea that they're, let me just finish the history for 1 second. 33 through 39, the idea is to make it impossible for Jews to live as Jews, therefore they will leave. Two problems with the strategy. The strategy fails because there's nobody who's going to accept the Jews in the numbers to which they have to go. The Nazi universe keeps expanding. What the hell are you going to then do? They invade Poland, so they decide to ghettoize the Jews. And ghettoization is a form of containment. Isolation, segregation, containment. And the best way to look at the ghetto is they were containing the Jews. Now, here's where we come to what did they know? At the beginning, the Jews felt they were containing us until Germany loses the war. They come to their senses. They're going to persecute the hell out of us, but what are they going to do? They can't eliminate millions of people. They can't get rid of millions of people. So they began their ghetto making a life. The Germans said we're containing the Jews until, and in retrospect, but not in prospect, it was until two things happened. A decision was made what to do with the Jews, and the infrastructure was built to accomplish it. Ultimately, for the Germans, for the Nazis, and I use Nazis with a great specificity. Anything done by the state is German. So there are only German laws, German army, German occupation. Anything done by the ideology or by the party is Nazi. For the Nazis, it turned out in retrospect, until we decided what to do with these damn Jews and until the infrastructure was created for their extermination, for their murder. That occurred in 1942. And the infrastructure ultimately in Poland became the death camp. The final solution began in 1941 with the German invasion of Soviet-occupied territories. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Belarus, the Soviet Union, etc. That's when they sent mobile killers in to murder the Jews who were stationary victims, and they murdered people within sight of their homes. Meaning they took the Jews, they marched them to a valley, to a gulf, to a wadi, and they shot them by machine guns, one by one, village by village, town by town, city by city, men, women, and children. The most extreme of that was 33,771 Jews were killed in 2 days on September 28th and 29th, 1941 in Babi Yar, grandmother's valley in Kiev, and this is in the Ukraine. And you know, they bombed the TV station right next to Babi Yar. And the question was whether they destroyed the memorial or not destroyed the memorial. But the reason it's so awesomely symbolic is they murdered 33,771 people. And they counted, by the way. 2 days, boom. And where is Babi Yar? Babi Yar is about 1.25 miles from the center of Kiev. There became a problem with this modality of killing. Problem with this modality of killing is that the men who killed needed alcohol afterwards, and gradually they needed alcohol before, and sometimes alcohol during. Some had breakdowns, and some became numb. Some originally felt uncomfortable about the killing, and ultimately they became efficient and effective killers. The second problem with it, it was done within sight of the town, and I can show you a film in which you had kids showing up in short pants to watch people being executed, people they knew, people in whose home they had played, people whom they had gone to school with, and who the hell brings a kid in short pants to watch this? And there's a Roman Catholic priest by the name of Father Patrick Dubois, who's now interviewing these people, men and women who are now in their 90s, because this happened 81 years ago, interviewing them, describing what they saw and the like. So they then reversed it and asked the question, if you cannot send the killers to the victims, what's the next logical thing you do? You make the victims mobile and you send them to stationary killing centers. What are the stationary killing centers? They're the death camps, which are factories of murder. They are the combination of Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest with Henry Ford's assembly line. And their task is to essentially produce dead Jews and then to recycle those parts of the human body that are usable in the aftermath. What does that mean? Why bury somebody with a gold crown when you can reuse the gold? Why bury someone with their hair when hair is a great insulator, and hair is a very useful detonator, and hair is the ultimate form of lining, and you can even make mattresses from human hair. Auschwitz was liberated. They discovered 14,000 pounds of human hair, which were being accumulated for the what? For the next shipment. And figure out what your hair weighs to begin to imagine how much it takes to make up 14,000 pounds. And they did not make soap of the Jews because the Jews did not have fat. So they essentially used Jews as burnt Jews and the ashes as fertilizer. and even used it in part to salt roads in the winter, meaning that you reduced the Jew to a consumable raw material to be discarded in the process of manufacture and recycled. Now, let me show you, let me give you just one example about that. American slavery was horrific. Non-negotiable how horrific it was, but the difference between American slavery and the annihilation process is that slaves were considered a capital investment. How do we know slaves were considered capital investment? What did we have? Slave auctions and slave trade. And what did we also allow to happen in the United States? If slaves are a capital investment, what you allow is you allow procreation. Not because you want more, I don't even know what term to call, not because you want more, in those days you would have used an N-word, but people of color in the world, but because if my Chevy can back up to your Toyota and produce a Cadillac, what would they be doing every 9 months? They would be what? They'd be going tailpipe to tailpipe. It's a capital investment. In that sense, the Jew became what? The equivalent of what happens with the Coke can. You drain all mineral value from it, and then you what? Discard it at the end, and if you're responsible, you recycle it, meaning you use whatever is usable, which gives you, again, not to, God forbid, negate the evil of slavery, but to look at the structure of evil. So the ghetto was a place to contain the Jews until, and therefore, if you look at the Jewish experience, what is the ghetto? The ghetto has 3 phases. It has the original phase in which you're moving in and you don't know what the hell the future is going to bring. Then you try to make a life. And then you hear rumors of what? Impending deportation. And you're told what? It's what? Resettlement in the East. And all of a sudden you understand you can't make a life here and you have no idea what the next is going to be. What information did they have? And the most important point to understand for our purposes is that the Nazis understood at a certain point that they were engaged in the final solution to the Jewish problem. It became a priority for them. And I can prove to you in 30 seconds that it became a priority that took priority over the war effort. Let me show you what I mean, and that's incredible to imagine. Number one, what are the 2 dates in which most Jews got killed? 1942, 1944. What was the situation of Germany war-wise in 1942? It had invaded the Soviet Union, presumed it was going to capture it quickly, the Blitzkrieg. Got stuck in the winter of 41, 42, which thankfully was one of the coldest winters on record, and therefore understood that the war was going to take a long time. That meant that they needed all the resources to supply their troops in the Soviet Union, in the occupied Soviet Union. And that meant, in essence, that they deported the Jews to death camps when the same trains could have been used to bring soldiers to the front, wounded back to the rear, food, medicine, all of the elements that you need. That's the moment at which they what? They continued to build the death camps, operate the death camps, murder the Jews. And if you want to know the worst year in Jewish history, the year is 1942. More Jews were killed that year than any other year in history. And that was when the infrastructure was developed fully for the annihilation. In the occupied Soviet Union, they're murdering by bullets. in Poland, and gradually in the West, they are now murdering by shipping Jews to these factories, assembly lines of death. When's the second time that Germany is killing Jews in massive numbers? When the Nazis are murdering Jews in massive numbers, 1944. They deport 437,402 Jews on 154 trains, on 147 trains in 54 days. Destination Auschwitz. What's happening, and the dates, think of the dates. Dates are May 15th to July 8th. What happens on June 6th, 1944? D-Day, which means that they're now fighting on the continent of Europe. The Soviet Union is moving in from the east, the Americans attacking from the west. What are they doing with their trains? They're murdering Jews. Now, America, and this comes back to your question, Steve, America has one priority at the moment. If you're Franklin Delano Roosevelt, your priority is the war, the war, the war, the war, and the war. And in 42, we're doing lousy. 42, it does not appear that we're going to win the war. Attack on Pearl Harbor and the like, and trying to get the military-industrial complex that we now have today up to snuff. So he does not have particular time to pay attention to what he regards as a minor part of what's happening, which is the problem of the Jews, which they don't even use the word Jews, they use the problem of the refugees. And by the way, the Jews want them to use the word refugees also, because if you had a choice in saving refugees or saving Jews, everybody would say, don't save the Jews, save the refugees. And if you could distinguish between Jewish and non-Jewish refugees, we would have taken in the non-Jewish refugees. Is this clear? So that means that we have no consciousness in the United States of the Holocaust, except for the rare activists who have internalized the fact that Jews are being murdered in massive numbers. And they become the activists who irritate the establishment, who push on the government, who are, zealous for this matter. This is, there's a fellow by the name of Peter Bergson who becomes an activist on this, but literally no consciousness of the Holocaust. When do we develop consciousness of what we call the Holocaust? We develop consciousness of the Holocaust when America liberates the camps. And we don't liberate the death camps. We liberate the camps in Germany, and most particularly in Western Germany. And something has happened which make these camps and the images of that horrific. What's happened is there were death marches from the death camps, most particularly Auschwitz. And then all of a sudden, these camps became overrun and could not contain the population. They couldn't feed them. They couldn't bury the dead. They couldn't provide medical treatment. And consequently, when we entered the camps, we thought, and these are battle-wearied soldiers. These are soldiers who had killed, who had seen buddies die. They enter the camps and they see something they've never seen before. And for the most part, they're scared. And then something very interesting happens, which is that in order to prove how wonderful it was to fight these bastards, the press comes in, the motion pictures, the newsreels come in, and all of a sudden the newsreels are played. And in those days, you went to a double feature on Saturday or Sunday. We had no television. You went to a double feature Saturday or Sunday, which is you went to see two movies broken up by a newsreel. And the newsreels were the equivalent of the before cable news of CBS, NBC, ABC, visual things. Susan Sontag said, "I've never seen something so devastating. Something in me broke, and it's never come back together again." That was the film of the liberation of the camps. And some of the images you may even have, and you may even remember the image of the bulldozer coming in Bergen-Belsen. Why did they use a bulldozer in Bergen-Belsen to bury the dead? Because in Bergen-Belsen, you had a typhus epidemic. So severe was the typhus epidemic that 13,000 people died after the liberation, despite the best medical treatment that was available. So all of a sudden, there was a consciousness. Dwight David goes to visit Ohrdruf on April 12th, 1945, which Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies. And he said, I went to visit every nook and cranny, and I made the visit deliberately because if someday they want to say it's propaganda, I want to say I was there. George Patton, the tough bastard, couldn't even bring himself to walk into certain places. That's how horrific it was. Man who could go into battle and order men into battle and all of this couldn't bring himself to see this. So what does Eisenhower do? Eisenhower orders that essentially German civilians be brought through to see what their government has done. He orders the press to come. You've all heard of the great guys. The man was Joseph Pulitzer, who was a prominent editor. He said, I came here believing it was an understatement, that it was an exaggeration, and I've returned back by saying it was an understatement. Period of time, there was a consciousness of what this represented. And that's the moment of confrontation. Boom. The second moment of confrontation was a basic decision at that point. We can't conduct business as usual in the aftermath of this. Consequently, we went to the Nuremberg trials. Now, unlike some of your perceptions, the Nuremberg had nothing to do with the Holocaust. They're important today because we hear the words again: crimes against humanity, wars of aggression, right? These are words we're using again and again now. Nothing to do with the quotation marks Jews, except for one thing, that the moment of, and the Nuremberg trials were interesting in the sense that they were given such prominence that the President of the United States, who was by then Harry Truman, asked the Supreme Court justice to take a leave of absence from the court, something that had never happened before. Robert Jackson to serve not as a judge, but as the American prosecutor. Now, the only time the Holocaust was represented at the Nuremberg trials was at a very interesting moment, which is they showed a film of the death camps, not of the death camps, of the concentration camps. Because the death camps, America did not liberate the death camps. The only death camp that was liberated by the time that let's go back, Majdanek was liberated whole. And if you go to Poland, you know the most powerful camp to visit is Majdanek, because all the stuff is there. They didn't have time to destroy it. You walk into the crematoria, you walk into the gas, you walk into a place with hundreds of thousands of shoes, with tens of thousands of uniforms. Auschwitz, in that sense, has all of that material, but not in that quantity because they blew up the crematoria. They destroyed all of this stuff. Majdanek was liberated in July of 1944. It was captured whole. It was reported on the front page of the New York Times. The guy said, I've now been to the darkest place of hell. But it wasn't believed until it was what? Until it became visual and visceral. Liberated by the Soviet Union, they took films, and you all know the films that are involved, the little kids walking between the tracks and holding up their numbers and all of that. That's the attempt by the Soviet Union to document the crime. We came in April, not in January, and we came into the concentration camps in Germany and in Austria and came across all of this, and they had collapsed. So you had bodies laying around strewn and all of that, and the people were the equivalent of the Walking Dead. They made a tremendous impact on the soldiers. The press came in, congressional leaders came in, the films came in and came out, and for a period of time, there was a consciousness of the Holocaust. Nuremberg trials come. And then the second stage of the Nuremberg trials did not get as much attention, but ultimately were more significant. The significance of it, for example, they had the doctor's trial. Now, the doctor's trial didn't focus on the greatest crime the doctors committed, which is, I don't know how many of you know, but gassing began. Not with Jews, gassing began, and I'm going to use non-PC terms because it's the only way to make you understand their world, began with those who were an embarrassment to the Aryan supremacy. So how do you have a master race and a quotation marks retarded child? How do you have a master race and a handicapped person? How do you have a master race and a congenitally ill or an emotionally distraught, enfeebled, crippled, etc.? And I'm using terms that we don't use in our society, but they were called two things that you have to understand. They were called life unworthy of living and useless eaters, because they consumed resources that could be better used for somebody who was healthy and handsome and strong instead of somebody who was enfeebled. We believe special needs demand special attention. They said, give them and use the resources to preserve the species, the master race. That wasn't what they got the doctors for. They got the doctors for the medical experiments that were conducted. And the medical experiments that were conducted, because the idea was that if they're not human beings, we can as guinea pigs. By the way, an idea that also known in the United States. You all know the story about the syphilis, people who were not treated for syphilis so they could follow the infectious path of syphilis. They were obviously blacks, and who the hell has to pay attention to blacks? And consequently, we did not treat them for syphilis. We could have cured them for syphilis, but instead the scientists studied it and followed it for it, etc. Now, one implication of that came forth was they did not know what criteria to use. So the judges came up with 10 principles of medical ethics, many of which, all of which are in use today. But the first principle is something that you all know if you ever have an operation. The patient is entitled to be informed of their treatment and to consent to it. Now, any of you have ever had an operation, any of your relatives who have ever had an operation, what does the doctor do before the operation? Doctor comes in, informs you of what he or she is about to do, and asks you to sign what? A consent form. They probably do not know, and you probably did not know. That is directly related to the first principle of ethics at Nuremberg. Second example, which you also, I hope you haven't experienced it, but you will know people who have experienced it. The patient is entitled to stop treatment at any point. And some people who have gone through a lot of pain and suffering have said, I've had enough. Right? Just give up. Doctor wants to try one more experiment and they say, no. That's, again, the second principle of Nuremberg. So you go through and it establishes medical ethics. Third is that the judges were tried because the Nazis, my teacher, the late Richard Rubenstein, who died this year, once had a thing that almost got him, he infuriated the entire universe by said, Nazis committed no crime. The crime was the legal system under which they operated. They did everything legally. The legal system itself permitted it all. And we like to think the system is a just legal system. Here was a legal system that was unjust and was enforced by the judges. Let's give you a simple example. How did they in part confiscate Jewish property? The rule was that if anybody left the country and left property behind, that property belonged to the state. So the moment the Jews were deported, who benefited by the property that was left behind? The state. And by the way, that wasn't always the case because we have examples now of very interesting thing. When the mobile killing units came in certain areas, the killing was done not by Germans, but by locals. In Lithuania, 66% of the Jews who were killed by Lithuanians. Why did they want to kill their own Jews? They wanted to do two things. They wanted to prove their utility to the Germans because they had cooperated with the Soviet Union. And the second thing is, why would you not want to benefit by confiscating the home, the property, the non-portable wealth that could not be transported? You can't transport an apartment. You can't transport a farm. So consequently, what they did is they wanted to kill their own Jews so they could both murder and inherit. And therefore, it was all of this question of the legal system being used. So the judges were tried for the legal system. And the last trial I just want to talk about is a trial because you're going to hear a little bit about it. The mobile killing units, those who went in and killed, were brought to trial. The prosecutor was a 27-year-old Harvard graduate who's now 102 and still alive by the name of Ben Ferenc. And there's a wonderful movie about his career called Watchers of the Sky. But Ben Ferenc tried it, and what he did was very simply, he brought a document to somebody and he said, is this your signature? Read me the first two lines of the document. And the document was the Einsatzgruppen reports, which indicated on September 28th and 29th, we eliminated 33,700 Jews from Kiev. Boom. And he tried the case in 2 days. The defense tried its defense, took a long time, but his prosecution was 2 days. He asked no more questions than, is this your signature? Read me the document. And they were hoisted on their own petard. They were tried with their own words. And that became an interesting trial of documents. So in the 40s, the consciousness was immediately on liberation. And then their consciousness came at one more stage before it began to erode completely. And this is the stage that we're interested today in very much. And that is that there was a man by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish refugee and international lawyer, who introduced the word genocide. Side is murder, and nobody here teaches biology, it's the genus, it's the species, the murder of a species. And his idea was that if we codified it, if we named the crime and if we yelled at the crime and called it genocide, we could somehow prevent it. That became a legal decision of the United Nations, signed on by the United Nations, passed by the United Nations. And we're facing one of the interesting consequences of it today, because they're talking about, is it or is it not genocide? And part of the definition of genocide is targeting people because they're a member of a group in whole or in part. Now, remember, the difference of in whole or in part is very important, because it doesn't define for you how whole and how part. The Jews were to be murdered in their entirety. But if I target one person, is that genocide also? Nobody is saying he wants to eliminate all of the Ukrainian people. But is he killing someone? Are the Russian troops killing somebody because they are Ukrainian? And the definition becomes in whole or in part. And if you ask me, because of the peculiarity of that definition, you'd have to say that he is committing genocide, but this is not amongst the Holocaust. You following the difference? This is not the Holocaust, meaning it's not eliminating all of the Ukrainian people, but they are targeting Ukrainians because they are Ukrainians. By the way, one of the other things is the forcible removal of the population. And the third part, one of the other elements of the genocide, which is one of the terrible crimes that the Nazis committed in Poland. And this is associated with a very interesting town. If you're ever in Poland, one of the most beautiful towns in all of Poland is a town called Zamość. Zamocz. Zamość is a Renaissance town located between Lublin and the Ukrainian border. They went into this town, they kidnapped blonde-haired, blue-eyed, high IQ'd children. They took them away from their parents and they raised them and they had them adopted as Germans and brought them into Germany to be adopted by other families. Now, I say this in a very particular way. If your child is killed or dies, ultimately there's a finitude, there's an ending to it. You ultimately have to what? Come to terms with it, even though you never heal. You're broken, but the problem with kidnapping your kid, in addition to everything else, and I don't mean to minimize it, is that you never can get over it because you always believe that the kid will walk into your house, or you see somebody. It's 35 years later, I see somebody who looks like he could be my son, and I wonder, are you my son? What's your origin? What's your background? Anybody who walks around I always imagine that what? I'm going to be reunited. Consequently, it is an open wound in which you can't even develop scabs because every time you see somebody who looks like potentially your kid, 30, 40 years later, you could what? You can't come to terms with it. So one of the things that they prohibited was that. The second thing that developed in 1948 was something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Genocide was a legal document. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is what I call an aspirational document. Let's define human rights into the world. Now, it's bizarre because among the people who signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Stalin's Russia, Stalin's Soviet Union. Among the people who signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the United States, which was what? Segregated with Jim Crow, right? If you came down, you had what? Colored only, whites only, right? Couldn't check in hotels, you couldn't bathrooms, you couldn't eat at lunch counters, all of those things, and yet we signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. By the way, we didn't pass the Genocide Convention through the Senate till 1988 under the foreign policy chairmanship of Jesse Helms, with Ronald Reagan becoming the guy who proposed it. For 40 years, it was regarded as an infringement on US sovereignty. Late 40s, something else happens, and it's also associated with what we have with the Berlin airdrop, the Berlin airlift, and that is that we discover that we now need Germany because we want Western Germany to be an ally in the Cold War. And we're afraid of two things. We're afraid Western Germany is going to become like Eastern Germany, which is a Soviet ally. And Western Germany is also otherwise going to become neutral like Nehru and all of those people. And consequently, we can't insult the German people by what? We have a new enemy, new political circumstances, so we're no longer fighting Nazism, we're now fighting communism. And therefore, we have to minimize anything with regard to Nazis coming into the government or Nazi war criminals taking place. So by the late 40s, there is an attempt to minimize any of these events. The only other major thing that happens in that time, and this is enormously major in terms of Jewish history, is the establishment of the State of Israel. And also that left two things happened at that point at the same time. Number one, the bulk of the Jews who were survivors of the Holocaust ended up going to Israel. And that means it got rid of the DP camps, and the visibility of the scars of the war became Israel's problem. And then the second thing that happened is Harry Truman began to accept a larger number of immigrants and expanded the quota usage, and we had the migration of survivors to America. And that's the way in which survivors came in the first in 46, and then again in 48, 49. Survivors came in, and one of the things that Harry Truman did consciously, and interestingly enough, at tremendous opposition, is he integrated the armed forces of the United States as a response to the racism that we had experienced in Nazi Germany. Conscious decision to make that the armed forces would be integrated, precisely because we had seen the divisions of racism that were involved in World War II. And what happens at precisely the same time? The integration of baseball with Jackie Robinson. And that is that these are cultural impacts, again, not so much on Jews, but clearly the bringing in of immigrants is focused on Jews, but the integration of the armed forces and the notion of the integration of baseball, all of them mean that we had learned something about general racism. And we were going to try to do a little bit better. By the way, this is an evolving type of thing. Remember, 54, you get Brown versus Board of Education. And then you also have the beginning of the entire civil rights movement in the 50s with the Freedom Riders and all of that. But part of this is deliberately traceable to the type of racism that we had experienced during World War II. And let's also talk about something else that happens among the liberating troops. This is a technical definition, but you should understand it. Blacks were serving in a segregated army. And Japanese Americans who were serving in the army, and they were serving in units, they had parents who were interned in internment camps in the United States. So when they came into the camps, they feared that this was the world that their parents were experiencing. Now, they were technically, some people argue they were technically not liberators because they were given the quotation marks. I guess I can get away with it because we're talking about also, they were given the shit work. They were given the cleanup work. And consequently, they were sent in 48 hours, 72 hours, 24 hours after the actual liberation, because their job was then to clean up the place and to work with the like. But it was a deep confrontation between one victim group and another victim group. And many survivors will tell you it's the first time they ever saw an actual black face, because Europe was lily white at that point. And certainly for Japanese Americans, there was this tremendous fear, Japanese American soldiers, tremendous fear of what? Of the fact that this was the fate that awaited their parents, because they heard camp, camp, and they thought of that. This is the 40s. Clear? Any questions on this? I want you to ask a question so I can have a moment to drink my Coke. Any questions on the 40s? Okay, so we've done an hour and 20 minutes. We've done 10 years. Okay. 50 becomes interesting. And the 50s has a couple of enormously marking terms. Very interesting. The first presentation to the American people on on national television of the Holocaust becomes a 1953 program called This Is Your Life. Now, most of you are not old enough to remember This Is Your Life. This Is Your Life was essentially telling the story of somebody's life in as a surprise to them in a 30-minute program. And one of the people chosen is a young, rather sweet-looking, good-looking Holocaust who had married an American. And the program became This Is Your Life. Her name was Hannah Block-Kohner, and it was told as a perfect story with a happy ending. The happy ending of the perfect story was she met her husband, she got married, she rebuilt her life, and she was reunited at the end with her surprise guest, a brother she had not seen. At that point in 1953, she hadn't seen him in 13 years. Her brother was in Israel. He had become a physician. Brother and sister are reunited after 13 years. They can't leave go of each other. They're the only remnants of their family. What is the issue in America? At that point, there was an ocean of General Electric. Progress is our most important product. America was about the future, not about the past. And consequently, this was, you have the perfect happy ending. We all suffered in our past. We came to America, and what do you do in America? Prince Charming meets the beautiful princess. They live what? Happily ever after. You have a second narrative that takes hold. A book is published, which is now regarded as the second most widely read book in the world next to the Bible, and that's the Diary of Anne. Now, literary critics of the Holocaust will tell you the Diary of Anne ends precisely as the Holocaust begins. What's the one element of the Diary of Anne Frank that has a glimpse of what's happening? It's her dream sequence. And you have 7 people living in hiding, and it ends with the knock on the door, and never tells you what happens to what? To Anne Frank afterwards. Lawrence Langer says the most important book about the Holocaust never written was this young girl's diary once she had gone beyond the life in hiding. And that is, Anne Frank concludes with, she's taken from there to Westerbork. She is then deported in 1944 on the next to the last train that left Westerbork, destination Auschwitz. She goes to Auschwitz. Her mother stays in Auschwitz. She and Margot then come to Bergen-Belsen on the death march from Auschwitz. And the very interesting thing is she dies within 4 weeks of liberation of a typhus epidemic. What is the great line of the Diary of Anne Frank that is highlighted? I believe that man is good at heart. I can't build my future what? On the grounds of pessimism. I'm paraphrasing. I can read you the exact phrase. I cynically say that man may be good at heart, but the Holocaust is certainly not evidence of that. But what do we have? We have this a wonderful story of a woman, a young girl's maturity, her life in hiding, and we see a couple of elements of it that make it palatable. Number one, Otto Frank, who is her father, who discovers the diary. After he comes back, does a couple of things. He eliminates some of the rough edges between mother and daughter. Now, some of you are old enough to have had teenage daughters. And teenage daughters and mothers of teenage daughters do not necessarily get along. It's a tough relationship that gets better with time. And she's got lots of nasty things to say about her mother, all of which are toned down. Can't blame Otto Frank. What do you want to put out there? The second thing is that it becomes, after a diary, it becomes a play. And the interesting thing about the play is there are 2 versions of the play. There's the Meyer-Levin version of the play, and then there's the version of the play that has been appeared on Broadway. The Meyer-Levin version of the play has much more Jewishness in it. But the rule of America at that point is you can't be TOO Jewish. You have to tone that down, and this has just enough of a glimpse of Jewishness to make sure that you know it's Jewish, but not too much to what? To make it too particular and not universal. This was a time where Jews were a little bit too afraid to be Jewish in public. There's a great short story called Eli the Fanatic by Philip Roth. What is the story about Eli the Fanatic? There's a group of Jews who have moved out into the suburb, and all of a sudden, one of the Jews gets religion. And he appears in a beard and a kaftan. And who are the people who hate him the most? Fellow Jews. Why? Because he's breaking their cycle of assimilation, acculturation to America by appearing TOO Jewish. And consequently, for Anne Frank to break in, in one sense, you have to neutralize the quotation marks Jewishness of her to make it palatable, to make it seem like a little bit of an American family. Toward the end of the decade, there's something that tells you that the unspoken sometimes becomes louder than the spoken. There is Playhouse 90 has a brilliant play. Playhouse 90 used to present 90-minute plays on television, original plays on television, and it had Judgment at Nuremberg. It had one problem with Judgment at Nuremberg, and that is it was sponsored by the American Gas Company. And consequently, the word that was bleeped out on television was they were murdering the Jews by the unspoken word gas, which everybody heard. And it, in unspoken, said something more than had they just gone out and then you saw an ad for gas immediately thereafter. And the like, many years later, when you had Schindler's List appear on television, it was sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, sort of as penance for Henry Ford's and the old Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, and they did not break for commercials. They got a commercial at the beginning, they got a commercial at the end, they didn't break for commercials, deliberately wanting to make sure that they didn't end up, what? In that situation, everybody who knew television understood very well that the like. What was the intriguing thing about Judgment at Nuremberg is, again, the most powerful part of that relating to the Holocaust was the film within the film. And then the German defense lawyer essentially accused everybody. Didn't the Vatican know? Didn't the Americans know? Didn't the Western world not accept refugees, et cetera, et cetera? In other words, he tried to universalize the guilt from the particular people involved. Obviously, that's not how the Judgment Nuremberg transformed itself. It then became, in 1961, 62, it became a very powerful movie with Spencer Tracy, and enormously powerful. And again, the most powerful part of that is the film within the film. Now, there's a debate in the literature, and there's a very good book by a very fine historian by the name of Hasya Diner, who spoke about the beginning of the consciousness of the Holocaust in the 1950s and saw it as enormously widespread. Survivors began to talk and the like, but many survivors will tell you that they began to talk, but Americans were not ready to listen. They would tell their story and somebody would say, you think you had it bad, you should hear what happened to us. We had rations. We had to have coupons. or they would tell their story, and they would say in a very real respect, they would say, everybody had it bad in Europe, then they came here. You want my advice? Worry about the future, not about the past. And we're going to see that transformation in a very dramatic way as we go through the decade. Point being, and I have to say, because I'm a child of the 50s, and I grew up in Hebrew-speaking Jewish day schools, and I spoke a fabulous Shakespearean Hebrew, meaning the following, that the first time I asked for directions when I was in Israel, I said the equivalent in Hebrew, if your heart inclineth in my direction, would you kindly indicate to me, thy humble servant, what is the proper path upon which one should take to reach his anointed destination? They then made me say it out loud on the bus, on the microphone on the bus, and everybody laughed at me, and I had made a total and complete fool of myself. I also spoke a Hebrew that got me into a little bit of trouble because I didn't realize that in modern Hebrew, the word no is the word of, is in the ancient thing, the man knew the woman and, she begot. So I kept speaking about all, and Israelis make a distinction between knowing and having the acquaintance of. And I kept speaking about all these people I knew, these girls that I knew, these boys that I knew. And oh my God, I must have been the single most promiscuous guy around. And since I was a teenager, I wish my life had been that colorful. It was not. But the point being that my teachers were either survivors or refugees. And the most interesting thing is we had heard words. We were the generation of ice, and I was raised in an intensely Jewish neighborhood and went to Jewish schools. And we had heard words. We had heard the words camp, death, murder, children. No context. And in fact, we were the generation of ice cream and whipped cream who were to make up for this glorious generation that was destroyed. And then we saw our teachers, and in those days, if you had a tattoo, you wore long sleeves. And they would raise their arms and have a tattoo. And what were the two moments that I don't want to tell this to teachers, but two moments that you used a pen and wrote on your skin was A, if you were going to cheat on an exam, right? If you're going to cheat on an exam, you wrote some answers down on your thing, and lo and behold. Or the other is if you finally got the courage to ask that pretty young lady, you have a pen, but you realize you don't have a piece of paper, and she gives you a telephone number. And what are you going to do? So you have the ultimate embarrassment. You have to write her number on your arm, and then you forget about it, and you shower, and then you're wondering what the hell happened. So we had no context. So Hasya Diner documents, and she's a terrific historian. She documents something that is not in keeping with my experience as a kid. And I grew up in a second context, synagogue, that was comprised of German and Belgian Jews, for the most part, who had escaped in the late 1930s and early 40s because they were all in the diamond business. And if you were in the business, you had portable wealth. If you owned real estate, you couldn't move your real estate. If you owned a factory, you couldn't move a factory. But if you had clothes, you could sew diamonds into the lining of your what? Lining of your coat. You could swallow it. We have stories of people who swallowed it. You could put it in private parts by using condom, ever have you. And consequently, you could escape with a modicum, and they were trying to rebuild in the United States the life they had left behind. But it was not put into context for me. And not being put into context for me, I remember distinctly having a lot of impressions, but no knowledge. Lots of information, but no knowledge. And if you look at my career in one sense, what did I accomplish in life? There's a simple way. There's a simple way to describe it. I was able to tell to the American people in museums and to other people in museums a story that I only heard in fragments. And then I was able to allow the people who couldn't tell me their story to tell their story to the world. So in one sense, that's a summary of my career. But when I was a child of the 50s, then the world in which I wasn't hearing this, I wasn't knowing it, I was getting glimpses, fragments, and the like. And that's what happened in terms of information. The 60s come out, and then there's this incredible, and we're going to take a break in 5 minutes just because I have to have mercy on you. 60s come about, and the 60s begin with regard to the Holocaust in a very incredible way. They begin with the capture by the Israelis of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, and his essentially being taken to Israel, kidnapped and taken to Israel and brought to trial. Now, the interesting thing, let me just give you a historical note. The interesting thing is the Israelis really didn't want to capture Eichmann, and everybody was searching for Eichmann. But the Israelis had a problem, which is they were concerned about the threats of German scientists who were going to Egypt and Syria and who were building the infrastructure to destroy the current state of Israel. And they wanted to concentrate their intelligence operations on that. A prosecutor from Germany by the name of Fritz Bauer comes to Israel, and Fritz Bauer is he's a German Jew who returned to Germany after the war. And he became a prosecutor. And his problem was he got information about Adolf Eichmann from a very intriguing source, a blind man whose daughter was dating Adolf Eichmann's son. Half Jew. And because he was blind, he heard, if you're blind, you sometimes hear better because your hearing compensates for what you don't see. He brought word that Adolf Eichmann was hiring as Clement in Argentina. And at that point, Fritz Bauer was afraid to turn it over to his own people because it would go through the German Nazi underground, and Eichmann would be warned, and Eichmann would what? Escape and go deeper underground. He brings it to Israel, and Israel is afraid that if they don't go after Eichmann, the word's going to leak out that they didn't go after Eichmann. And then if the word leaks out that they didn't go after Eichmann, Israel at that point is comprised of a very significant percentage of its population are Holocaust survivors. They didn't call them survivors, they called them refugees at that point. Survivor becomes an honorific term, and Israel at that point was also not inclined to treat the survivors with a great respect. Only the people who fought back were worthy of respect. They didn't want, they saw them as the embodiment of the diaspora Jew, the Jew in exile who was powerless, who was passive, who was reticent, et cetera. And these were the new guys, the new Jew. And by the way, one of the ways to explain it is that And it's easy for kids to understand in a very real way because kids have a consciousness, positive or negative, but an acute consciousness of their body. Because their body is beginning to expand, they're beginning to develop muscles, breasts, hair, all of that, an acute consciousness. And the idea is whether you're proud of that body, the world of the body, or you're not proud of the body. And the Israelis were now trying to recreate themselves as Jews of the body, and instead of the stooped scholar, the guy in short shorts with big muscles, the woman in short shorts and a tank top who was able to, work the farm and do all of that. So they were even called in Israel at that point, pejoratively, they were called sabonnikim, soaps. So the Israelis capture Eichmann, and then Ben-Gurion announces to the Knesset that I want to announce that Adolf Eichmann has now been in Israeli control and he will be brought to trial in Israel. Now, what was peculiar about Adolf Eichmann? Adolf Eichmann, in one sense, he was the subordinate in the SS who dealt with the Jewish desk. And he was the one who was known to many Holocaust victims because he appeared directly and negotiated directly with Jews. So he negotiated directly with Jews because he was in charge of getting rid of Jews, getting Jews out of Vienna in 1939 and 40, 38, 39, and 40. Negotiated with them. He was in charge of the German operation in Hungary. He and his subordinates were in charge of the German operation in France, et cetera, et cetera. So he was visible in the way in which the people above him were not visible, and he had negotiated directly. The Israelis decide to do something quite, first of all, a word about the interrogation. And this is because I promised you 1:45, it's going to be a little bit later. Because I edited the police interrogation of Adolf Eichmann, the English language of it. The people who interrogated Eichmann interrogated him from Sunday to Friday. When they went home on Friday, they needed about 3 hours to walk in the woods to get rid of, to decompress and what they would say decontaminate. They have one moment which is very interesting, in which the Poles give them something called the Auschwitz Chronicle. Auschwitz Chronicle is a list day by day of the people who arrived in Auschwitz and the numbers that they were given, the transports that came in, et cetera, et cetera. It's been published now as the Auschwitz Chronicle. They want to establish that it's evidence. So they're saying, how do we establish that it's evidence? We need to know somebody who knows what number he has and the day he arrived in Auschwitz, and correlate the number with the day. And we need to do that randomly with 20 or 30 or 40 people to be able to see how accurate it is. One guy by the name of Mickey Rosenberg, whom they did not know was a Holocaust survivor, was a police interrogator, raises his arm, reads off his number, says April 2nd, 1943. They look up April 2nd, 1943, the numbers given out correlate. They say, and they didn't know that he was a survivor of Auschwitz. They then say, do you know anybody else who's a survivor? And he jokingly says, do I know survivors? I can take you through my whole neighborhood. And they make a series of calls, they get a series of calls, and all of a sudden they can correlate it. The Israelis make a very dramatic decision, which is they're not going to make this a trial of documents, they're going to make it a trial of people. They're going to do one more thing, which later gets criticized, but they're only going to make it about Eichmann, they're going to make it as a public education tool, teach the whole story of the Holocaust. And teach a human story. sometimes exaggerated. There's a great comment by David Ben-Gurion to the opening statement of the prosecutor. His opening statement, and the opening statement begins with Pharaoh and ends with Eichmann. And Ben-Gurion puts a note in the margin which says, I think between Pharaoh and Eichmann, you really should put Hitler in. Meaning, stop elevating Eichmann to etc. First time that anybody's heard survivors in a public forum. Every night, everybody is seeing it, is hearing it on radio in Israel. It didn't have television. And Israel also decided to make it a public thing. This is before satellite TV. They filmed it during the day, and at night they brought the films they duplicated the films, they brought it to the Israeli airport, and they sent it to every country in the Western world on planes. Therefore, it was broadcast the very next day. And because the courtroom did not allow the camera, they did something else, which is they built the second room behind the wall. You cannot hear the camera. And they did something else, which was quite remarkable, which is they kept one camera only focused, which never moved. Consequently, an attempt to understand who was this man, who is the killer. This then transformed the notion of the Israeli narrative to all of a sudden the survivor is treated with respect and with dignity, and as the keeper of a narrative, the keeper of a story, who has something to say. And all of a sudden it became a cultural phenomenon. Front page newspaper every day, front page on radio, and people are listening to it day in, day out, et cetera, et cetera. I was in Israel as a youngster visiting Israel at that point, remember some of that cultural impact. Now, the second impact of the Eichmann trial became interesting. It's associated with Hannah Arendt and with a quotation marks report on the banality of evil. Now, that became a question. Who was Eichmann? Was he a monster? Or was he what? An ordinary human being? And this becomes a debate in the 90s as well, the debate between Goldhagen and Browning. Were these ordinary men or were they monsters? I just want to comment one thing on the Arendt thing. She makes a categorical mistake of the highest magnitude. If she said report on the banality of the evildoer, she would have been 100% correct. But the evil itself was not banal. Do you know the difference? Eichmann was an ordinary man, put into an extraordinary circumstances in which he performed an extraordinary deed, but the evil that was committed was hardly banal. And she made a categorical mistake to try to define the evil instead of the evildoer. Become great philosophers of her generation, a political philosopher who had written a brilliant book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, worth reading today, especially in the world in which our democracies are fragile. But she made a dramatic mistake, and the Eichmann story galvanized the Holocaust in Israel and made it acceptable for survivors to tell their story. We'll continue after a break.
Real quick, before everyone gets up, while we still have our wonderful photographer here, is it possible for me to get a group shot in the front? Would everybody find that? Would that be okay? Rose, I'll have her guide everyone. That would be wonderful. Man, y'all gotta be really, by the end of the day, but I figure I'll catch you while you're all still awake and still moving around. And everyone who's online, I want to open up the gallery view real quick.
We have a lot of things in common with the world. My father was a survivor, but he wasn't.
So he spoke about times and we had a very yes, you just pointed that out to me.
I think I sent you next to my baby. This is my mom.
Oh, how do you do?
Yeah.
Take their cameras, and actually display themselves, that would be really cool.
I don't want to go on camera.
If you
Oh,
can hear
yeah,
me.
a bunch of blank faces. There we go. Much better.
Just for a minute, just so we can get you all in the picture, that'd be great. Okay.
Okay. Right in the front. You can-
Yeah, we got a few more people coming who are taking their cameras out.
I'm just trying to see.
Okay.
Let's see.
Here,
Let's
I'll-
stand up and do
here.
it.
Here, I'll squirt, that way I'll put the shiny on top of my head here.
Mhm.
Memorial. I brought Lily.
Yes, I see.
Memorial.
Oh, I can't get up anymore.
Yeah. Awesome.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to thank you. Wonderful, the way you're telling everything.
Thank
I
you.
really
Convicted. Eichmann is ultimately convicted. There's an interesting thing because there's a debate whether Eichmann should be put to death or whether the ultimate punishment would be to make him see a living, breathing, thriving Jewish community day by day. Screw you, you failed. Just an interesting story. The great philosopher Martin Buber was not in favor of putting Eichmann to death. He asked to meet with David Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister, and only in that generation, prime minister said, "I will come to your house." And he said, "What do you mean? I'm certainly will go to your office." He said, "There'll be many prime ministers of Israel, but there's only one Martin Buber," which Buber accepted in all of his modesty. Having said that, Eichmann was put to death and he was cremated, which is exceedingly unusual in Israel, and his ashes were spread in the sea so that he would not become an icon, and he would not do that. If you want to know the notion of survivor as damaged goods, there is an exceedingly powerful, very bitter movie that was done by Sidney Lumet, Pawnbroker. Pawnbroker was a 1964 movie, which Rod Steiger, and Rod Steiger plays a man by the name of Saul Neiserman, who is living but dead, emotionally dead, living. And the most interesting, there are three parts of it. Number one, it's how memory comes. His memory of the Holocaust comes in fragments that he's trying to fight. Somebody comes in, he's a pawnbroker, somebody tries to pawn a diamond ring. He sees images of a diamond, of people being forced to take off their rings and putting them in a container in the Holocaust. He's on a train and all of a sudden he sees the train as the deportation train. He sees a beautiful woman who reminds him of his wife, and he sees images of his dead wife and the like. And there's an image of two survivors, one who provokes life, said, "Look, we almost were killed, we're now alive. God damn it, enjoy it and have, all the freedom. You no longer have to be scared of death. You've seen death straight in the face." And the other guy who's emotionally dead. in a very real sense. But if you want to see survivor of the 60s as emotionally dead, this is the one film to look at. And it's an exceedingly powerful film. It's also for Rod Steiger, had his greatest moment of acting in which he sees the fellow who has been working as his assistant who is shot, and he stands over the body and he screams, but he doesn't utter a sound. It's a silent scream. And what that does, ironically, is to force the audience to put the screen, it forces the audience to put his scream in their imagination. And in that sense, it's the silence of survivors who want to scream, but they don't scream. And we have to imagine their scream. Two things happen in the late 60s that are important. One of them becomes an interesting theological debate, which features what was then popular, the death of theology. And Richard Rubinstein, who was a rabbi, raised the question. He said, no future Jewish theology will make any sense unless it comes to terms with the twin revolutions of modern Jewish history, which occurred 3 years apart. One is the Holocaust, and the second is the establishment of the State of Israel. And he said they shatter Jewish belief. How do you believe in a God who is good and a God who is engaged and active in history, and a God who cares about humanity, allows the Holocaust to take place? All of the traditional definitions of theodicy will not work. There's no, if we believe that somehow sin is responsible for punishment, there's no sin that would justify such a punishment. And the fact that, and then also, what is Israel? Israel is a revolution in Jewish thought. It's essentially saying we're not going to wait for God to redeem us. We're going to redeem ourselves to the best that we can in an imperfect world. Rubinstein raises that, and that for the next quarter of a century becomes the central, one of the central theological questions that all Jews ask about themselves and their tradition. But something else happens which is far more decisive in understanding the Holocaust, and that is the 6-Day War. Now, if you go back to the 6-Day War, you have to understand that for 3 weeks, Israel stood on the brink of the war. It was surrounded at that point by enemies. The Egyptians came from the west, the Syrians came from the north, the east. The UN withdrew. America, which had said it was going to keep the Straits of Tiran open after the 1956 war, did not do that. And the Arabs said something which became a mantra, geographical mantra, but they touched a very raw nerve in the Jewish imagination. They said, we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. Clear, the reason for that is because the Mediterranean Sea is to the west of Israel. If you're going to get rid of the Jews, where are you going to put them? You're going to put them in the sea. You're not going to absorb them into your thing. What they didn't understand is that there is a central prayer on the High Holy Day, which is one of the two most central prayers on the Holy Days. It says on Rosh Hashanah, it is written, on Yom Kippur, it is sealed. Who shall live and who shall die? Who by fire and who by water? Now, I'm not saying that people heard it, I believe almost in the subliminal imagination, in which they perceived one generation by fire and one generation by water. And all of a sudden, the Holocaust and the State of Israel were linked. And this time you had a very different ending. Though I have to say that it's not clear who won the 6-Day War yet, even though Israel won the battle, because the 6-Day War is still being, ironically, still being fought. Having said that, for the Jews then, the linkage of the Holocaust and the State of Israel became visceral and emotional, powerful in the most extraordinary way and subliminally driven there But this time you had a happy ending, and in one sense, you could have imagined that Jewish history would read, we went from the Auschwitz to the glories of Jerusalem. Boom, end the story. But obviously that has now opened up the new chapter of what does Israel be, how does it deal, how does it grapple all of those issues. But since then, in a very dramatic way, the Holocaust and Israel have been linked. Indisputably linked and indivisibly linked, and for a generation, subconsciously linked in the deepest way imaginable. I also lived through that story. I was in Israel during the Six-Day War, so I can tell you in the same way that I lived the story of the 50s and that silence, I lived the visceral linking of the two and the coming together. Go to the 70s, and the 70s has a exceedingly dramatic moment, which occurs a year after Roots. Roots essentially was a transformative moment because it said all of a sudden that television, which had been the mainstream, and television could not be, at that point you had 3 channels or 5 channels at the most. Some of you lived in a world that just was beginning to get cable television at that point because you lived in remote areas. You had 3 to 5 channels, and you also had something else, which is they hadn't yet developed the clicker. And the clicker is a major thing because you used to choose, in those days, you used to choose one lineup of cars, General Motors, Ford, or Chrysler, and you went up from, you know, a Chevy to a Pontiac to an Oldsmobile to a Buick, and ultimately, if you really made it, to a Cadillac. But the other thing is you chose one channel, and unless it was really bad, you didn't get off the couch to change the channel. The idea of the clicker was the beginning of the erosion of one's attention span. And if you do television or documentaries, you got to keep people's attention before they what? Before they click. And you even see cable news no longer has an ad between the different things. They go immediately into the other because they don't want to lose you for ads and the like. Roots says all of a sudden that the experience of African Americans and the experience of this group could go mainstream into the American population. By the way, the other consciousness, the Holocaust becomes in the civil rights movement as well. There's an acute sense of it. The guy, ironically, who introduces Martin Luther King to the audience before he says, "I have a dream" speech, is Rabbi Joachim Prince, who in 1964 says, "I was among the last rabbis of the Jewish community in Berlin, and I learned one thing during that period, that the ultimate problem is not race, the ultimate problem is silence." Silence. And by the way, in the 67 war, that then establishes the career of Elie Wiesel, who becomes, as it were, the bard of the Holocaust, linking the state of Israel and the Holocaust. And prior to that, he was a little-known starving writer, and all of a sudden, he's speaking poignantly. And in fact, somebody calls him the de facto high priest of the Jewish people, our generation, of that generation. Year after Roots, the docudrama of the Holocaust occurs. Docudrama of the Holocaust was 4 days, and essentially it would be, and somewhere between 2/3 of the American television viewing audience and 3/4 saw the docudrama of the Holocaust. And everybody was interested in it. The joke in New York City was that during the intermissions and the commercials, the water in New York City got dangerously low as people went to the refrigerator and the toilet. But everybody was watching it. And all of a sudden, survivors, instead of being damaged goods, became, as it were, transformed to witnesses. Docudrama of the Holocaust told the Holocaust in the story of one family, the Weiss family. An assimilated German family who looked very much like the American family that we could identify with. And they seemingly were in every chapter, everywhere in the Holocaust. Ironically, Elie Wiesel gave it the most review imaginable, called it trivialization, vulgarization, and the like, but its impact was enormous, transformative. None of these educational institutions would have been formed without it. And it showed, in essence, that this became a narrative that could touch the American people. And in Germany, I am quoted in a new documentary as saying something a little bit nasty but true, that the docudrama of the Holocaust had more impact in Germany than the original. With all of that irony, and despite the fact that I said it, it's a true statement. That occurred also at a very interesting moment in American technological life. That was the introduction, for those of you who are ancient people like I am, that was the war which these guys don't know. Both of these young ladies are friends of my daughter. They couldn't imagine that there was then a war between Beta and VHS. And Beta was introduced by Sears, which was then the dominant thing in the market, and VHS. But it also meant that you could start to record people with sound and visuals very inexpensively. It led to instant replay. It led to essentially, instead of broadcasting live, you broadcasted with the same quality on delay. And broadcasting live had all the problems of flaws. And I tell you a side story. One of the funniest jokes that Jack Benny ever told, this is an old comedian, was once approached and asked, your money or your life? And his response is, don't rush me, I'm thinking. Now, I met the woman who wrote that joke in an old age home in Los Angeles. And she said the problem for the audience at that point was it was said live. They all knew it was coming. And she said the entire crew, from cameraman to director to everybody else, had bloody lips because they had to bite their lips from laughing before Jack Benny said the line because they knew it was coming. All of a sudden, VHS allowed for the recording of survivors' testimony. And that's when the L project, the Fortunoff Archive, began. And that was the idea of survivors telling their story. A month after the docudrama of the Holocaust appeared on American television, you had the President of the United States, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the State of Israel, May 1st, 1978, invites 1,000 rabbis to the White House, and announces that the United States is going to establish a President's Commission on the Holocaust to recommend an appropriate national memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. Appoints a commission, Elie Wiesel as chairman. I was a staff member at that point. And the idea was that this is going to come to American national life. The conclusions say something about the Holocaust, something about the American Jewish community. And 13 years later, 14 years later, they lead to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. What are the conclusions they make? Essentially, 5 basic conclusions. Number one, the memorial will be in Washington, D.C., not in New York. In other words, you're going to say that we can take the bereaved memories of the parochial community and transport it to the center of American national life, and they have something to say to American national life. And the debate was, where do you create the memorial to the Holocaust? Do you create it in the largest Jewish city in the world at that point? Or do you create it in Washington, D.C., saying it can speak to the nation, not only to the bereaved community? The second thing that made was, we want a living memorial, which will be a museum, an educational foundation, an academic institution, a library and archive, and something called the Committee on Conscience, to watch in case of an impending genocide. Thirdly, it would be a public-private partnership, public and private funds, and its task would be to teach the Holocaust, and it would have days of remembrance to commemorate the Holocaust. And all of these things essentially over 14 years came to fruition. So all of a sudden you see the Holocaust going and peripheral concern to something that can come to the center of American national life. That's the 70s. 80s developed. The 80s, first of all, have a very interesting notion in film, which is the development of the film that becomes the early defining film of the 80s is Sophie's Choice. And Sophie's Choice is by William Styron, based on a brilliant novel by William Styron called Sophie's Choice. There's a pivotal moment in the novel of Sophie's Choice, which is interesting. You all know that Sophie has to choose between one of her children. One can live and die. That's what great literary historian Lawrence Langer calls the choiceless choices, which define the circumstance of the victim. Number one, it's a Polish Christian survivor, played by none other than Meryl Streep. And I don't have to tell you that Meryl Streep in her worst days is the best actress in the United States, if not in the contemporary world. In Styron's novel, at the moment of Sophie's Choice, Styron withdraws. Styron then says, instead of resolving Sophie's Choice, Styron says, what manner of a man is going to ask a person to choose between their two children? And then goes into the history of slavery and the nature of the evil that is uniquely to the Nazis. So he's right at the moment of confrontation, and in a very interesting way, and I knew Bill Styron well, he withdraws. He says, it's so beyond my ability that I can't play out the scene, which is an act of enormous integrity and, in one sense, understanding his own limitations as a human being, not as a writer, because Styron as a writer is really one of the great American writers. The very interesting thing in Sophie's Choice, and Meryl Streep, ironically for this, spends 6 months learning both German and Polish, which tells you that she works as an actress every day for 6 months. And I ironically know Meryl Streep accidentally because she's my college roommate's next door neighbor. And, and he doesn't know her as Meryl Streep. He knows her as a person they drove carpool with and went to Little League with and all of that. And she's not a glamorous actress at home. She is who she is, and he obviously knows that, but it's an informal thing. Can I borrow some sugar? And they live in rural Connecticut and the like. So she works like hell on this, and she expresses the entire dilemma in the inability to speak at that point before she blurts out a decision. Says, I cannot. And you see the difference in tools between words and the visuals. You then have an incredible moment which argues about Holocaust memory, which is the confrontation between Elie Wiesel and Ronald Reagan over the issue of Bitburg. 40th anniversary of the liberation, 40th anniversary of D-Day. Everybody is invited to commemorate D-Day except German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. And Helmut Kohl is very interested in putting the Holocaust behind him in German national consciousness. We're a country, we're 40 years past this, we're living in democracy. We're a prosperous country. Let's get rid of this burden. Let's get rid of this whole thing. What does he then do? He invites Ronald Reagan to put a wreath at Bitburg, and Reagan is seemingly unaware of the fact that it's also a place where you have the Waffen-SS. And the problem is, had it been, there's a myth in Germany of the good German soldier and the evil Nazi. But if you know the German army, the Wehrmacht, worked hand in hand with the SS. There is no good Germans. I mean, there may have been a good German soldier. There's no good German soldier whose hands are clean in terms of the killing process. Wiesel is getting a congressional gold medal, and he confronts Reagan and he says famous words, belong to a people that have been speaking truth to power. Mr. President, your place is not that place. Your place is among the victims. And all of a sudden, the great communicator is out-communicated by a charismatic survivor speaking from the authority of his experience. Ironically, Wiesel loses the battle. Ultimately, the Holocaust wins the war. Kohl wants to normalize German existence, get rid of the Holocaust, and regard it as something of the past. And dramatically at that moment, there's a realization, in one sense, the history can't be normal. And in essence, Holocaust consciousness has dramatically intensified since then. And interestingly enough, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, who had just finished 16 or 17 years in regime as head of Germany, she brought Holocaust consciousness to bear in Germany, not so much out of the Jews, but out of a concern for the German nation. She wanted the German people to be the Nazi people. And she fought because she wants Germany to represent the antithesis of the Holocaust. Pluralism, tolerance, democracy, freedom. And in fact, she was the one who led the issue of refugees, a massive number of Syrian refugees, but doing something very brilliant, spreading them throughout Germany so they didn't become a ghetto. And why did she bring the consciousness in? And Germany now is investing heavily in Holocaust education, not so much to remember the past, but to make sure it doesn't go in that direction in the future. Ironically, Wiesel also at that point, Wiesel believed in the dramatic gesture. He wanted the Holocaust Council to resign. And the reality is that if it had resigned, somebody else would have been appointed, the museum would have developed, and 50 million visitors later, it would have been a foolish gesture, because the war, in one sense, is won, even though the battle was lost. And Wiesel, in that sense, exaggerated the impact of what the President of the United States could do to transform this formative event. Late in the decade, something else happens, which is War and Remembrance appears. It's a Herman Wouk novel. And all of a sudden, you have things on television permitted in the Holocaust that were never permitted before, including much more graphic imagery, much more nudity, but it's not a nudity of sexuality, it's a nudity of dehumanization and violation. And part of that has to do with the coarsening of America. We've been through Vietnam, we've been through all of this stuff, sexual revolution, and you were able to put stuff in that was much more coarse. Come the 1990s, and the 1990s, in one sense, we can talk about the 1990s speaking in a very real sense of the era in which museums are founded. First to open is the Museum of Tolerance in February. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opens in April of 1993. And we were planning, hopefully, we would get 1 million visitors. And within days of opening, we had to ask visitors not to come because we're being overwhelmed by visitors. And since 1993, which means 29 years, it's had as many as 50 million visitors, 100 and some odd heads of state. And the question is, would America's people be interested in the Holocaust? The answer is yes. And not only that, but the Holocaust is regarded as a transformative event in a very dramatic way, so that, for example, the United Museum now and other Holocaust institutions, including this institution. Why? Because they want to see 1933 through 1941 when it's really a police action. Midshipmen and cadets get their first lesson in military ethics by visiting the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. The public all of a sudden voted with their feet. They voted by coming. And the Holocaust Museum was enormously controversial before it was created. And then all of a sudden, controversy died down. Why? Because in essence, the people have voted, the people have regarded it, and now that begins the notion of the Holocaust as a defining event of 20th century humanity, one that is fully capable of speaking to the American people in a very bold and dramatic way. And it also means, in essence, that something else happens, which is which we didn't realize then, but we're now experiencing dramatically, which is that there's a transition that takes 20 years of realization between the notion of institutions as a successor to survivors. The authority of the event now resides in institutions rather than survivors, because survivors are all too quickly going to be no longer. At the same time, months later, Steven Spielberg develops Schindler's List. And Schindler's List does a couple of things that are remarkable. Number one, Spielberg, who was then and still now the most successful film director in America, and at that point in the world, because film as an American dominates the world, decides he's got to tell this story. He throws out all of his tools and he uses it in black and white. He makes it 3 hours and 15 minutes. And the only weakness of the entire thing as a film is Spielberg can't end the film. If you think of the endings, it has 4 endings, none of which are good. I would say it's a multiple orgasm in which nothing is successful. What are the 4 endings? There are 4,000 Jews there are 4,000 Jews in Poland today. There are 6,000 descendants of Schindler's List. He has the survivors and the actual survivors and the actors go visit Oskar Schindler's grave. He has the final scene with Schindler himself, and he has them coming over the mountain singing a 1967 song when they're dealing with events of 42, 43, 44. In that sense, he can't end the film. And the other transformation, Spielberg expected to lose money. And he vowed, interestingly enough, that he was not going to spend it, not going to take a penny for it, and that everything would go to charity. And that's when he established the Shoah Foundation, which essentially an attempt now to in the period of time, survivors' testimony, and we gathered 52,000 testimonies in 32 languages from 57 countries, compiling what is now the largest database of a historical event, visual database of a historical event, and also creating something called the people's history. A people's history means you no longer have history written by elite, you who teach history. The data you normally have are people who wrote letters, diaries, and memoirs. But here you hear from professors and bakers, from shoemakers and seamstresses, from housewives and business tycoons. Everybody telling their own story. And the reality is there was a tremendous opposition to this from historians who said, wait a minute, survivors' memories are fraudulent, are faulty memories. You all know that part of what happens in legal trials is the problems with memory and what people remember. And also you have people who add things that weren't there. So lots of survivors will tell you about arriving in Auschwitz and seeing the gates Arbeit macht frei. They never saw the gates Arbeit macht frei. The survivors who arrived in Auschwitz came through Birkenau, which doesn't have those gates. But when you think of Arbeit macht frei, therefore they must have seen Arbeit macht frei. So the principle of using this material is trust but verify. And now historians realize that quantity also means quality. It's the first time you can get into different parts of the experience and experience the inner life of the ghettos, the inner life of the camps. You can experience work camps and all of that. And for anybody creating films now, it is an indispensable tool because you can get to every dimension of the human experience. And I have, in museums now, created probably about 200 such films and clips, and everybody works with survivors' testimony. And now you have probably between the Shoah Foundation and Fortunoff and the United States Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem, you probably have 80,000 testimonies, which give you tremendous visual material and mean that we're going to be able to hear the story of survivors for eternity. Now, let me give you one impact of this in a very interesting way. I want to speak to those of you who are Christian. Now, and think of what Christianity's sources are. Christianity has gospels, which do nothing else but what? Tell the story of the life of Jesus. But they're not stories that are contemporary. The Gospels are written later. Imagine now if you were able to meet all of the people who were touched by Jesus' teaching, who heard him speak. Imagine if you were able to meet the people who knew his parents. Let me not be theologically, who knew his mother. The people who knew all of the disciples when they were children. Imagine if you had that type of historical record. If you're Jewish, imagine what it would be like to have a Passover Seder where you could play the testimony of someone who was a slave in Egypt who went into the desert and walked and experienced freedom. Think of the tools that this involves with history. Let me give you one contrast. The Smithsonian has 36 testimonies of people, audio testimonies of people who were slaves. We have 80,000 of people who lived through the Holocaust. Think of that as a record. What does that mean? And think of also that, by the way, makes history more difficult because it's much more complex. But you have all the elements involved in that. That's the 90s. In the late 90s, New York's Holocaust Museum opens, and all of a sudden you have, again, this phenomenon taking place. 2000 has two things that occur that become enormously dramatic. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go 2000 and then I'm going to talk about contemporary times and wrap it up. I'm going to not let you off at 3. I'm going to take about another 15 minutes beyond that. If you want to walk out at 3, you're perfectly entitled to, etc. 2000 has a very interesting phenomenon, has the David Irving trial. Now, I am friendly, and I've known since we were children, Deborah Lipstadt. In fact, I am one of the people who has difficulty calling her Deborah Lipstadt or Ambassador Lipstadt, because I know her as Debbie. And I made a mistake once referring to her in a professional context as Debbie. I never will again do that. But you know people as kids, you go through. Deborah Lipstadt wrote a book called Holocaust Denial, The Growing Assault on Memory and Truth. She had a couple of paragraphs on David Irving. David Irving decided to sue her in London. He sued her in London. In America, if he sued her, he would have to prove that she libeled him by proving the truth of his statement. In London, it's the reverse. Lipstadt had to prove that what she said was factually correct. And the burden of proof is on the defendant, not on the plaintiff. Lipstadt, David Irving decides that he's going to be his own attorney. The admonition of any attorney who represents himself as what? A fool for a client. And ended up that he was beaten by his own words. And that is that a research team was established. A London scholar by the name of Richard Evans researched every one of the footnotes in David Irving's books by going back to the original documents. By the way, this later became an interesting film called Denial. So essentially, he went to each of the sources and showed how Irving selectively quoted the sources and misquoted the sources in order to exonerate Hitler. My colleague Robert Jan van Pelt went into the architectural structure of Auschwitz. Christopher Browning went into the notion of when the final solution was done. They then subpoenaed Irving's diaries. And the reason the trial became very important, the reason I call it the Irving trial, in fact, they call it not Lipstadt's victory, but Irving's self-inflicted defeat. And the reason for that is Lipstadt's winning or losing was unimportant except to Lipstadt and lots of her friends. Irving's defeat was absolutely essential. It meant that hardcore Holocaust denial no longer was credible because its most credible witness was proved to be what? A fraud, a racist, an anti-Semite. In fact, if Lipstadt was guilty of anything, she was guilty of understatement. He was worse than that. He taught anti-Semitic and racist jingos to his little kid, and he was essentially destroyed. And we have to worry about hardcore Holocaust. Had the bizarre circumstances later in the decade of 2000s, where you had our good friend Ahmadinejad, who was president of Iran, denying the Holocaust, and who was the person who admitted the Holocaust, the president of Germany. Now you got to ask yourself a question: who should deny the Holocaust? The perpetrator. And Iran had a very good record of saving and helping Jews during the Holocaust. It was a way station for travel to Palestine, which meant it was a rescue center. So the idea that Ahmadinejad would denied the goodness of his people, and the president of Germany said, we have to remember the Holocaust. What? Because it's the only way we can come to terms with our past. We did it, and we were wrong to do it, and we got to face it. And Ahmadinejad then became that. But he also showed a very peculiar thing which represented a certain anti-Semitism involved in that, not his anti-Semitism, but others. spoke at Columbia University. And when he said that there are no homosexuals in Iran, they left him. They broke into and regarded it as bizarre. When he denied the Holocaust and said anti-Semitic statements, they sat there quietly. Denying the Holocaust apparently was not problematic, but denying that there are homosexuals in Iran, that became problematic, ludicrous, etc., which showed you something about the audience, not about Ahmadinejad. 2000 also brought something else. The Swedish Prime Minister, and I just came from Sweden last week in which we dealt with this. Swedish Prime Minister convened a meeting of 32 heads of states, 46 nations, to consider Holocaust remembrance as a tool for teaching democracy, pluralism, and tolerance. The meeting began, listened to 32 heads of state, and the joke is somebody is still speaking in Stockholm, because not everything has been said many times, but not everything has been said by everybody. And 22 years later, they're still speaking. And the meeting began at 1:30 in the morning, and there were 3 gluttons for punishment by the time it ended, etc. What did he do? He began to say, we have to remember the Holocaust because this is the single most effective tool we have to teach the best of Western values. Pluralism, tolerance, the basic notion of human equality and decency, restraint on the power of government, etc., etc., etc. That led to the creation of IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is now an international body that deals with Holocaust education throughout the world. And that became the way in which 21st century humanity established the place of the Holocaust. And one irony, there were more headlines in the first 3 months of the year 2000, of the new millennium, on the front page of the New York Times, dealing with the remembrance of the Holocaust, than there were in the 12 years in which the events in Germany were unfolding. Okay, let me go forward now. Where are we today? Our danger is not Holocaust denial. Our danger is Holocaust trivialization, vulgarization, falsification, minimalization, and the like. We are now asking, the Holocaust still has remained the defining event. And now we're understanding that it's even, some parts of it are even more defining. I like to say with regard to museums that something intriguing happens in a museum. The exhibition doesn't, but the audience changes and asks new questions. Everybody is now asking a terrible question. What are the implications of 1918 to 1933 for our world? What happens when a democracy is fragile, when a democracy is polarized, when a democracy is dysfunctional? And if you think I'm describing Weimar Germany and not the United States of America, you're hearing the United States of America, and I'm describing Weimar Germany. How does a democracy become authoritarian and ultimately totalitarian? I'm describing what happened in 1933, but I can also describe what's been happening in several European countries, Eastern European countries in particular, that in 1989 became fascinated with democracy, embracing democracy, and by now have become authoritarian, going on another dimension. And we'll see what happens with our good friend, Mr. Putin, in terms of whether indeed he becomes authoritarian and the like. And you also see, ironically, even in China, the temptation, China had a deal, you leave the politics to us and we'll make your economic life good. And now we're seeing what happens with the authoritarian tendency taking place. So all of a sudden, we're asking different questions of the Holocaust. We're also asking different questions. Why is it that they were accepting Ukrainian refugees in Poland, but not Jewish refugees elsewhere? Or Afghanistan refugees? Or Syrian refugees? What does that mean? What does that do? We also have the question you asked, and remember, I'm now coming back to the question: how do we deal with the Ukraine? The Ukrainians were not only victims, but they were deep perpetrators. I worked on a museum at Belzec. 500,000 people killed between March and December 1942. 500,000 people murdered between December and March 1942. Staff Belzec was 14 Germans, 90 Ukrainians. Treblinka, the staff of Treblinka, 925,000 murdered. Staff 120, 30 Germans, 90 Ukrainians. The staff that cleaned out the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, Ukrainians assisting the Germans. The Ukrainians were involved in murdering their own Jews, as well as being victims. Now, why is it that Putin is resorting to the word Nazi? First of all, you got a problem in the Ukraine because the president of the Ukraine is a Jew. He's not only a Jew, but he's a Jew whose grandfather fought for the Soviet army against the Nazis. And his other grandparents were victims of the Holocaust, the mobile killing units that entered the town in which they lived in the Ukraine. So it's very difficult. And what did he run on? He ran on an anti-corruption platform. And then you have everybody resorting to the falsification of the Holocaust. Let's not deal with our good friend Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, and I say this with sadness, she made two peculiar mistakes. She, first of all, spoke of Nancy Pelosi and the Gestapo police. Now, she meant the Gestapo, but you also have to feel bad because she's apparently never had gazpacho. No, I mean, seriously. Most of us who've had gazpacho will order it again and again. It's a delicious dish. Why would you not eat gazpacho? And even if it's difficult to pronounce after the third or fourth time you've had gazpacho, it's it. Or she spoke of Jews having gold stars. Why would you compare mass, which protect human beings, and mass is a sense of mutual responsibility. Mitch is keeping himself safe, but he's also keeping me safe in case he, God forbid, has COVID. Why would you call that a Jewish star where symbolization is one of the stages of genocide, where you symbolize people, you identify them for ultimately murder them? You have even and I didn't bring this was almost the reason I should create a PowerPoint, and I will, as I work on this book a little bit more. You had the gates of Auschwitz where it says Arbeit macht frei, with the great lie, work makes you free. Somehow it didn't work there. Vaccines are safe. Gates of Auschwitz. The Holocaust has become the defining event. If you want to say something is evil, you scream Nazi, you scream Holocaust, you scream that language, because we've succeeded in transmitting as the defining evil, and then people want to either shout, scream, represent, misrepresent, etc., etc. That's where we are at this moment. Now, in Eastern Europe, you have a very different thing. You have an attempt to rewrite history in order to exonerate the locals and put all the blame on the Germans. So if you go to Budapest, by the way, if you want to go to a beautiful city, go to Budapest, but lose about 10 pounds before you go to Budapest because you want to eat the desserts. And, you know, the two places not to go if you've put on a lot of weight are Paris and Budapest. And I'm still looking for a PhD candidate in business who will tell me why somebody eats in McDonald's in Paris. Why would you eat in McDonald's when it's more expensive than some of the best food in the world? It says something about the modern world. Having said that, in Budapest, if you go to the Danube, they have the empty shoes. Why do they have the empty shoes? Because in the fall of 1944, the Hungarians, in murdering the Jews of Budapest, essentially tied them up and shot every other Jew to save ammunition, so they drowned because they couldn't support the weight. They tied them together. Hungarians, not Germans. If you go to Poland, they now have it illegal to talk about Polish institutions in collaboration and cooperation with the Nazis during the war. You also have Putin getting so desperate to use the Nazi analogy that he says Hitler was Jewish. Hitler had Jewish blood. Why? Because he wants to get away from Zelensky can lead a Nazi government even though he's Jewish. By the way, the reason for that rumor developed is Hitler's grandmother, Hitler's father was the illegitimate child of the grandmother who had a liaison for the man that she worked for. And you have that in Nazi regulation. Jews were not allowed to employ non-Jewish servants under the age of 45. And the reason 45 is there's a rumor that there is sex after 45, but at that point there was no procreation after 45. So there was even that suspicion, but there were no Jews in that town, no evidence that she ever worked in a Jewish household for a Jew at all. But that's the original rumor. There's the conspiracy theories involved. So where are we now? We're at a point where the Holocaust successfully is used as the definition of evil. And therefore, to call something evil, and to call something evil seriously, you ultimately have to invoke Nazi Holocaust, murder, extermination, et cetera, et cetera. The success has led to vulgarization, falsification, minimization, et cetera. You have one more quality in our world right now, which is anger-producing, frightening, and like. Actually, two qualities I'm going to speak about. One is Holocaust envy, and the other is Holocaust repetition. Go on the internet, you can buy a shirt which says 6MWE. 6 million wasn't enough. Well, you know, my mother would say, sometimes you look for the good news. What's the good news? The guy doesn't deny that there were 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. Just saying wasn't enough. Let's continue. January 6th, a guy's walking in wearing a shirt, Auschwitz staff member. Proud of wearing a shirt, Auschwitz staff member. Imagining what? That's something you should wear in public and can be proud of. And that's part of the characteristic of that type of repetition desire that's involved in all sorts of ways. Last point is, what's Holocaust envy? People want to, the Holocaust has occupied so central a place, people want to have their own Holocaust because they want to occupy, they want that evil to be taken seriously. Now, I haven't spoken about anti-Semitism today. I would only do that if you have the patience to ask questions, but I want you to understand where we are and the evolution of where we are, and also its rootedness and the like. Last point, in teaching the Holocaust, you have an incredibly powerful tool to raise, even in the state of Florida, all the issues that you can't be raised straight on. Use it wisely, use it carefully, use it responsibly. Responsively and responsibly. Let's take questions. Yes, your name and where do you teach?
I teach, my name is Maria Hornick, and I teach AP Spanish language and literature. And somehow I have to link it with story, with history, okay? And a student asked me, and I probably answered incorrectly, and I don't know, how can I answer a student simply? Why did Hitler hate Jews?
Interesting question. The interesting part of that is Hitler also had a relationship with Jews. Give you a couple of interesting examples. Hitler served in combat with a Jew, and in fact, with a Jew who was awarded several medals and understood that they were not cowards. Hitler also had a Jewish doctor by the name of Felix Bloch, who treated his mother for breast cancer. In 1939, and there were people who said that Hitler developed his hatred of Jews because this doctor was, cut his mother's breast off, a mastectomy. But I'm using cut his mother's breast off because psychologically it's eliminating the milk that gave rise to his life, et cetera, et cetera. There's counter evidence, which is very interesting. Hitler saved this man's life. In 1939, he allowed Felix Bloch to leave Germany and immigrate to the United States. So if that was the origin, why did he save his life? And the like. He was looking, the question, and Jews sometimes answer that with a joke. Blame it all on the Jews and the bicycle riders. Why the bicycle riders? Why the Jews? Meaning that it was a useful victimization. It became an obsession with him. We have a seamless line of Hitler from 1919 to the last will and testament that he wrote in 1945 when he was about to commit suicide, all of them with anti-Semitism. He knew Jews. In the art world in Vienna, he saw Jews, but he also saw the political utilization of Jews. He probably believed conspiracy theories, and conspiracy theories, we know what it of not only anti-Semitism, but of all sorts of other things. And by the way, we're living in a time of conspiracy theories. Question becomes, if the Democrats were brilliant enough to be able to marshal the 2020 vote for President of the United States, why did they screw up on the Senate? I mean, if you could change the President of the United States, why didn't you get senators? Why didn't you get 60 senators? If you can manipulate everything, why can you only manipulate that? Why do certain people say, I was legitimately elected, but Biden was not? So conspiracy theories work. He embodied that. He experienced that. And the other part of it is you have to ask the question, and remember, you don't blame the victim for their victimization. But the Jews occupy a very particular, let me give you an ideological reason why Hitler had to oppose the Jews. And ultimately even Christianity. But he couldn't oppose Christianity up front because he had to, and the Nazis tried this, they tried to de-Judaize Christianity to get rid of Jesus as the Jew. What is the opposite of survival of the fittest? That is the notion of all human and the notion of justice and mercy. How do you have a world of mercy, a world of compassion, and this is the way, and who do we treat in a world of mercy? The widow, the orphan, the stranger. Man is created in the image of God, fundamental to the Bible, the antithesis of the notion of the master race. So he had to, in that sense, the more master race, he had to defeat these fundamental ideas in Judaism. And he didn't even oppose Jews, he opposed the Jew. And he ultimately would have opposed that and could have opposed and tried to oppose that in Christianity itself. They have images of and publications of the New Testament, which eliminates all references to Jesus and Jewish tradition. And who knows, had they triumphed, whether they indeed would not have gone in that direction. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
My name's Kristen, and I teach 8th grade language arts. I often get, so, you know, movies or, you know, LA Lifestyle or things like that. Don't forget, you know, it doesn't happen again. And you hear that over and over, but children are asking, you know, we're seeing genocide happen. We're seeing these things
Okay.
happen. So
Terrific question. We can't, never can, because problems live in a world, and look, the one thing our students have a bullshit meter that is absolutely perfect. They know when you're lying to them, right? They know it as when their parents are lying to them. They know it when their schools are lying to them. They know it when their institutions are lying to them. And by the way, isn't it horrific to be a child today? Isn't it horrific to walk into school the next day? So I don't say that. I say not with my consent, not with my acquiescence, not with my silence, not with my agreement, and not without my complete and total opposition. But we can't say never again. Because what we've learned is again and again, say, I want to make this clear. There are some elements about the Holocaust that are enormously distinct. There was a debate in my era, was the Holocaust unique? The great Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer says it's unprecedented. Now, unprecedented is something that's frightening because it means now there's a precedent. I got scared. I taught at Georgetown for 20 years, and I was teaching in these in the undergraduate college, but the College of Arts and Sciences. But I also got a lot of students who were studying in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. And I was always afraid that there was a son of one of the kings and one of the princes who was taking notes in my class about what the wrong so he could commit perfect genocide. Right? And when I had a couple of people who I know their fathers were major power, and it wasn't mothers, their fathers were major powers in countries that they ruled despotically, I was always afraid to point out what mistakes were made. I was afraid they were about to make notes and send notes to their father and to the ruling party. So we have to be very what's distinct about the Holocaust? Let me go through it in a very basic way. You understand, and I'm going to do it off my notes in this because I have it outlined in. Okay. 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 Yeah, the Holocaust was, first of all, evolved over 12 years. It ultimately involved, it created never before the killing center. And the killing center was so effective that Belzec, for example, killed 500,000 Jews, 10 months. It was all encompassing. It was the single national priority. It was done irrespective of the military situation. And what's worse, it was done by the most cultured, the most civilized, the one with the best art, the best music, the best literature of any other country in the world at that point. It represented the darkest side, the most evil potentiality of Western civilization. Let me give you one. Well, I'll give you two, very brief. We have seen economics. Northern factories moved south, deunionization, lower taxes. They then moved to the third world, lower wages, less regulation, et cetera, et cetera. What's the ultimate expression of the movement to decrease labor and the rights of labor? The expression is to regard labor as dispensable and only the commodity as something worthy. Get beyond slavery to reduce the human being to be discarded in manufacture and recycled. Potential. Even slavery did not go that far because the slave had value. The Jews were dispensable. What can I tell you? Auschwitz created a factory in which 700 million Reichsmarks, $42, were invested in the factories around Auschwitz. And you don't invest $400 million for a year. You invest it for a very long period of time. So that's involved. The second is religious anti-Semitism said, convert. We don't want you to live as a Jew, convert. Political anti-Semitism, we don't want you to live as a Jew, we're going to expel you. Social anti-Semitism says, not in my yard, not in my home, not in my country club, not in my this, not like. Nazis said, nothing, not at all. No place to live. The goal is, and they use the language, extermination. They were exterminated to take care of cockroaches. You all are exterminators, right? What do you, termites and cockroaches? They reduced human beings to termites and cockroaches. Again, the most extreme. So I can't, and because I don't believe it. I wish I could say you never. Last point, and I'll say this. Martin Luther King had a dream that he wanted his son to be judged by the content of his character, not the color of his skin. I would like to leave to my sons and daughters a world in which their father was irrelevant. That what I know about the world was useless. My dream is to become irrelevant. I'd like to be an ancient historian. Instead, what I'm finding, and you know, my wife kids me about this. She says, you know, they don't stop calling. She said, you know, she came back, something occurred a couple of years ago, and she said, you know, I used to believe that we had too many Holocaust museums. Now I believe every city has to have. Because look at the goddamn world in which we live. My dream is to become irrelevant. I am confident, unfortunately, that I'm not going to live to see that. But you guys can make it happen if you teach another generation and you also explore with everybody else. Now, what are we trying to do? We're trying to teach the most fundamental of human values. human dignity, human decency, human equality, respect, restraint, appreciation. And we're also trying to teach the best of American values. All persons are created equal without the 3/5 clause and the exclusion of women, et cetera, and all the other things. Restraint on the power of government, inalienable rights to life and liberty. I'll leave the pursuit of happiness away, but at least life and liberty. Freedoms, et cetera. And again, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, all of that stuff. That's why this fits in. Okay, let's call it a night.
So we'll be starting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. If you got any questions, I'm sure before you head out, I'm sure I'll feel free to come up. If you have any questions with me, if you cannot find everything linked at the beginning of the
Not at all.
in the agenda, or giving your feedback and your reflection, take you to Google form. If you get any questions, just let me know. If you don't feel like you get it today, it's not going to be the end of the world. I'm not looking for it today. I'll be looking at everything on Saturday, because that's when I'll do the rest of my job. So if you got any questions or any problems, let me know. If you can't make it tomorrow, or you want me know. I'm not see you tomorrow. Thank you for coming in today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I take a picture?
Sure, please. Sure.
That worked really well. Everyone heard you pretty good. Thank you, sir. Everyone at home, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and sign off. Appreciate you. We'll see you tomorrow. If you have any questions, reach out via email or via the app. Thanks.
Somebody lent me their charger.
Yeah.